Hello everyone, and welcome to Assetto Corsa Competizione. And this game throws a lot at you when you first get started. I should know, as of this recording, I've had the game for less than a week. So today's Getting Started guide is going to focus on two very important aspects of the game. Number one, I'm going to give you some of my initial impressions on the different cars that are available to drive here within Assetto Corsa Competizione. And then the second aspect is setup adjustments. We're going to talk about some very quick tweaks that you can make to the car that can have very lasting effects and improve your overall enjoyment of the game. Before we get started today with my initial impressions on the different cars, I wanted to share a few pieces of information to keep in mind. First and foremost, in the top right-hand corner of the screen, you will see the version of the game. Right now, we're talking about 1.8.12. And I know since its initial release, this game has gone through a lot of changes and a lot of performance adjustments. So today we're focused on version 1.8.12 and nothing prior to that. The second thing is what you're going to be hearing today are my thoughts and my opinions about the different cars, my likes and my dislikes. And of course, I very much expect that a lot of you will have opinions that vary greatly from that. That's part of the fun of sim racing, is that we all have our preferences, things we like and things we don't like. So your impressions may be very different from mine, but my goal today is to give you my thoughts, something to help a beginner just getting started in the game and give some direction as to which cars or types of cars and styles may be the ones you enjoy the most. But again, keep in mind, these are simply my thoughts and feelings. And finally, because I wanted to focus on driving all of the different cars, or at least as many of them as I reasonably could, I wanted to focus on a track that I was familiar with. So for me, I chose Spa. Spa is a track I'm very familiar with, which simply meant that I could focus on learning the cars and the setup options as opposed to spending a lot of time learning the track itself. So with those items in mind, let's jump into it. The first time you see the list of cars available in this game, it can be quite overwhelming, particularly if you're new to sim racing or simply new to GT racing. There's a lot of information here. So where do you start? Which cars do I want to drive, and how do I start making that selection? So in order to do that, I needed to add some filters to my list. The first filter I made is we're only talking about GT3 cars. So immediately, everything you see labeled as GT4 is filtered out. Okay, all of these I'm not interested in, only the GT3. Second thing is I'm only dealing with the base game, no DLCs. And that means some of these cars, for example, some of the 2022 versions may not be available to me since I don't have any of the DLCs. And the final filter that I applied was that, as you can see in a lot of the cases of these cars, for example, the Aston Martin, there are two different versions of the car. There's a 2013 and a 2019. I only focused on the most recent version of the car that I had access to. So that's three filters that I put in place that greatly reduced the number of cars on my available list. And then finally, as I mentioned earlier in the video, I did not attempt to literally drive every car on this list. I did play favorites to an extent. There are a few that I filtered out simply because I wasn't terribly interested in driving them. So you're not going to hear about them in today's video. However, based on what we're going to talk about next, I don't see that as being a huge issue. You'll probably know everything you need to know about these cars, even without specifically talking about each of them. And that is Lexus and Jaguar. I know that I did not drive those cars, and there may be one or two more in the list after applying the filters that I did not touch, but the reason that's not going to be a huge issue is something I picked up on right away. All of these cars essentially break down into one of two categories. There's front engine and there's mid engine. Now, as I mentioned before, when I talk about specifics to these cars, I'm referring to how they felt to me on the track. I'm not dealing with actual manufacturer specifics. So much like whenever I say a little bit later in the video that a car felt heavy versus another car, or it felt like it was down on horsepower, I'm not dealing with the specifics of how much horsepower the car had in relation to other cars or how much the car weighed and so forth. I'm simply dealing with how the car felt. So it's entirely possible that a car that is front engine in real life, I might describe as a mid-engine car simply because that's how it felt for me. Let's go ahead and hop straight into front engine versus mid-engine. So as I move through the individual cars, that's the most important thing you'll want to know is which of these two categories it fits in a very general sense, because it will give you an idea of how the car is likely to handle even before you hit the track. Let's get started with front engine. Front engine cars are going to be the most beginner friendly simply because they have more nose weight. The car is going to feel a little bit heavier, but it's also going to be very stable, and that is a great thing for a beginner. Again, if you are very familiar with these cars, maybe that's not as important to you, but if you're just getting started with GT racing or sim racing in general, then a front engine car is probably a very good choice as you're learning the different tracks and the overall feel of the cars. Front engine cars, very stable. They're going to feel a little bit more sluggish and heavier in general, but that's a good thing if you're a beginner. They're also going to take the curbing very easily. You're going to have really no issues getting the car out of shape by aggressively using the curbs. Another very beginner-friendly attribute. Your braking as well as throttle inputs can be a lot more aggressive, and just overall in general with this car, a front engine car, you can be very aggressive before the car will get out of shape. And that brings us into the mid-engine cars. In general, mid-engine cars rotate a lot better. They're a lot quicker to rotate, and they are a lot more balanced as far as the weight. They will feel lighter on the track. However, that comes with some trade-offs. The mid-engine cars generally feel more nervous, more twitchy, especially if you're being very aggressive and really hustling the car. Your throttle inputs and your braking inputs are going to need to be more precise, because you can very quickly get yourself out of shape and in trouble in one of these cars. Also with the curbing, you're going to need to be more careful and more deliberate about using the curves, because once again, it's very easy to get the cars out of shape. Now, when we get into talking about some setup tweaks, you can very easily tweak each of these types of cars to move them in the other direction. For example, in a front engine car, with some setup tweaks, you can make it less stable. You can make it rotate quicker and easier. You can make it more twitchy if you want. And of course, the same goes for the mid-engine cars. You can make them more stable. You can make them easier over the curbs and so forth. But I'm simply talking about the default. If you're using the default setups, those are in general the characteristics of the front and the mid-engine cars that you're going to come across. So with that in mind, now let's move into some of the individual cars that I tested. Let's get things started with the Honda Nsx Gt3 Evo 2019 iteration. This is the car that started it all for me. The very first car I drove in Assetto Corsa Competizione, and it was my introduction into the mid-engine car category. This car was very nervous, very twitchy and darty. In fact, when I first jumped into this car without any setup tweaks, it felt more like I was wrestling the car than I was driving and racing the car. However, after some setup tweaks, it became much more friendly, and it is now one of my absolute favorite cars to drive. Next up is the Bentley Continental GT3 2018 edition. This car was actually the second car that I drove in Assetto Corsa Competizione, and my introduction to the front engine style of car. This car drove so drastically different than the Honda that I initially thought there was a problem with my wheel. This car is unbelievably forgiving and stable. In fact, if I were advising an absolute beginner in which car they should start off with, it would be the Bentley Continental GT3. It is that stable and that forgiving. I could do pretty much anything I wanted to with the curbing and drive the car as aggressively as I wanted to. That is how stable and forgiving this car is. Next up is the Aston Martin AMR V8 Vantage GT3 2019 edition. This is a front engine car that felt like a lighter, more nimble version of the Bentley. Next up is the Audi R8 Lms Evo 2019 version. This car for me felt like the extreme version of the mid-engine car. It was very light and agile on its feet. It cornered very quickly, but it was also very darty, very twitchy overall. And it is the car that I had to fight with the most and ultimately tighten up the most just to get it stable enough to run consistent laps. Next up is the Bmw M4 Gt3 2022 edition. This car for me was the best balanced front engine car. It felt amazing as far as the balance and overall grip. Curbs were not an issue. I could be extremely aggressive with this car, but at the same time, the rotation of this car was very nice. In fact, the only thing that took some getting used to with this car was the gearing. My shifting points were a little bit different in this car as opposed to some of the other cars I tried. But overall, a wonderful car to drive. And of course, we have to talk about Ferrari. The Ferrari 488 GT3 2018 edition. This mid-engine car felt glued to the track and was an absolute joy to drive. In fact, the only negative that I could say about the car is it felt a little bit heavy overall and wasn't the fastest of the cars, but it was an absolute joy to drive. Next up is the Mclaren 720S GT3 2019 edition. This car was an absolute joy to drive. It was so much fun, and for a mid-engine car, it was remarkably stable right out of the box. It handled the curbs very well, had a lot of grip. In fact, in a lot of ways, it was similar to the Ferrari, except it felt a little bit lighter on its feet, and it didn't quite share that same glued to the track feeling. And then we come to the Mercedes AMG Gt3 2015 edition. This is a front engine car that was easily my least favorite car in the game to drive. And as much as I hate to say that, I just could not redeem this car. While it had all the attributes of a front engine car, it was very stable and easy to drive. It just felt slow and cumbersome and very boring to drive overall. Next up, we have the Nissan GT-R Nismo Gt3 2018 edition. This car was a bit of an enigma for me. It seemed to have characteristics of both the front and the rear engine car, and overall was just hard for me to get a handle on, and I never quite got the car where I wanted it. On one hand, the car rotated very well, but it was also very twitchy and very nervous, which made me think of it as a mid-engine car. But on the flip side, it also handled the curbs very well, which made me think of it in terms of more of a front engine car. But overall, it was one of the slower cars I drove simply because I could never quite get the handle exactly where I wanted it. And of course, no discussion of GT racing would be complete without the Porsche. Today we're talking about the 991 2019 edition. This car handled unlike anything else in the game for me, and something that I could never quite get a handle on. The car seemed to pivot off the rear tires, of course, with the engine being so far back in the car. It was just something I could never get a good feel. The car aerodynamically felt incredibly tight, and when I combined that with the feel of the suspension, I could just never get the balance where I wanted it. Even after making several tweaks, the car just didn't have the feel that I was looking for. So this is a car that, unfortunately, as much as I love a Porsche, I could never quite enjoy the way I wanted to. And last but not least is the Lamborghini Huracan Gt3 Evo 2019 version. This mid-engine car was smooth, it was responsive, it was very well balanced and great over the curbs. In fact, the way I describe this car is very much the same way I describe the Mclaren. It was simply a joy to drive. Now that you've had an opportunity to hear my thoughts on several of the GT3 cars available within the game, I'm hoping that will help in your decision-making process on where you want to go, which direction you want to go, and what type of car you want to drive. The main take-home message here is that regardless of whether you favor the front-engine cars or more of the mid-engine cars, there are so many great choices within this game. And really, the AMG was the only car that I didn't enjoy driving. Some of them were faster than others for me. Some of them were better suited to my driving style. But they were all a joy to drive for the most part. So there really is no wrong choice within the game. But now let's move into the garage, where I'm going to show you a few quick tweaks that you can use to adjust the car's performance to better fit your driving style. For our purposes in today's video, we're going to be talking about the aggressive preset setup in the Ferrari 488. But don't worry, the tweaks that I'm going to talk about today will apply to all of the cars within the game, and I'll talk specifically at different points about how I would tweak a front engine car versus a mid-engine car. But before we get into any tweaks of any kind, I do want to mention that it is very important that you become consistent in a car before trying to make any setup tweaks. So if you're going to start off with the aggressive preset or even the safe preset, regardless of which one you start off with, I highly recommend that you work on consistency. And that simply means that you can run lap after lap after lap on a track and get very consistent lap times, and you get very good at your braking points, your turn-in points, your throttle points, and so forth before you make any tweaks. Once you have reached that goal, then you can begin making tweaks. And the first thing I always recommend is getting a baseline. And that simply means run 5 to 7 laps at speed so that whenever you come back into the garage area, the information that we're going to look at in a moment will be valid. Okay, it's not good enough to just run a lap or two at speed and then try to get these values. Always try to run at least 5 to 7. The more, the better overall. As we begin our setup discussion, I want you to keep a couple of things in mind. Number one, this is not a full-blown setup video, so I'm not going to be going through literally every part of the setup. I'm only going to hint at a few things that I do immediately upon hopping into a new car. The second thing is I use symmetrical setups, especially at the very beginning, nothing track specific. So today I will only be referencing the left front and the left rear, but in a symmetrical setup, we would also be doing the same thing over here on the right side. But to save a little time, I'm only going to be dealing with the left front and the left rear. Okay, so with those things in mind, let's hop into the setup. The first thing I want to point out to you is about PSI. We want this PSI hot value, in my experience, to be around 27.5, so 27.5. Now, I don't know for sure that that is the perfect number, but from my experience so far, it has been a very good baseline for me to shoot for on each corner of the car. So 27.5 is what we're looking for. Now, how are you going to get that number? Obviously, you see that right now it's at 0. Well, that's because I haven't been on the track yet. So the way you're going to get a good value for the PSI hot number is to simply do a quick run, 5 to 7 laps at speed, and then check this value, and then adjust your PSI accordingly. The first thing I do for every car I get into is to change the front toe out to 0.1. So the negative means toe out, positive, which we see in the rear, will be toe in. But for our discussion, we are going to just focus on the numbers themselves and not the plus or the minus. Just remember, negative in the front, positive in the rear. The first thing I always do, 0.1 on the front toe, and the same thing on the rear toe if I'm in a front engine car. This gives you a lot of stability in the car by having these two values the same. So after I do my initial run, let's say that the car needs more rotation. I need to get into the corner a little bit better. Then what I generally do is I will come in and I will increase this tow value a little bit. This is generally about as high as I will go because I prefer to work in other areas of the car that we'll look at, but that is an easy adjustment that I like to make. All right, so let me put these back to being the same. So what would I do in a mid-engine car immediately upon getting to the track? I would still set the front tow the same, but in the rear, I would go higher. I would go with a 0.15. Reason being, in a rear engine car, I need to add a little bit of stability to the car. So by increasing this rear tow, making this more positive, I can accomplish exactly that. Okay, so with the tow out of the way, the camber, I can also tell you very quickly, I maxed these out. Most of the preset setups will have these maxed out, but if they're not, that is one of the first things I also do. Now with the tires out of the way, let's move into electronics. My baseline for the electronics in every car is very simple. I simply move all of the options to 3 for traction control or ABS. Now, some of the cars, such as the Ferrari, you'll see this TC2 option down here. To keep things simple, I leave it identical to the TC value. So again, 3s across the board, and then ECU map, I also leave at 1, which is full power, and then I don't mess with the telemetry maps. So again, this is a very beginner-friendly setup. Not a lot to talk about here on the fuel and strategy tab. You'll get more in depth with this once you get into full races, longer races, that type of thing. But one thing I did want to point out here is that in my initial impressions for each car that we did earlier in the video, I was referring to a car with 62 liters of fuel in it. So I wasn't talking about a qualifying setup or a hot lap setup. I was talking about more of a race setup. Here on the mechanical grip tab of the setup, I actually wouldn't recommend making any changes at the very beginning to this tab, particularly if you are a beginner, but I do want to provide a couple of notes on things that you might want to look at tweaking down the road as you get your setup more and more dialed in. Starting off with a front engine car. In a front engine car, you're probably going to need to get more rotation out of the car, loosen the car up a little bit, and you can do that one of two ways. One way is to simply go down 1 or 2 clicks on the front spring, or go up 1 to 2 clicks in the rear spring. Those will free the car up or add more rotation to the car. However, if you are in a mid-engine car and you are looking to add some stability, maybe take a little rotation out of the car, have it rotate a little slower, then you're going to want to increase the front wheel rate or decrease the rear wheel rate. That gives you a couple of options a little bit further down the road once you get used to the car. The dampers or shocks settings in the setup are also not an area I would recommend for beginners. However, much like I did on the mechanical grip tab, I will give you a couple of suggestions once you get more familiar with the car and you start to dial in the setup more and more. And that is, if you feel like the car is a bit too bouncy, maybe a bit too stiff and rigid, then simply back off of these numbers. Reduce these numbers by a click or two and see if that helps with the handling. Again, these are not beginner-friendly setup changes. These are a very easy way to dial a car out if you make drastic changes here in this window. However, if you're getting a little bit deeper into your setup changes and getting the car more dialed in, and you feel like maybe the car is just riding a bit too harsh and you would like to soften it up a little, then reducing these values by a click or two can certainly help with that. The last area of the car that we'll cover in today's video is the Aero tab. Now there is a lot going on and a lot of detail to be covered in this tab, but that is well beyond the scope of today's video, which is focusing on getting started in the game. And this is an area much like the mechanical grip and dampers where I do not recommend making any changes to the car here until you have gotten very familiar with the car and you're really starting to dial in specifics on the setup. So with that in mind, the one thing I do want to cover for today's video is the relationship in ride height between the front and the rear. Here you can see that we do have a slight difference where the rear is 4 millimeters higher than the front. The take-home message here is that the higher the rear ride height, the looser the car will be in high-speed areas. So if you're at a track like, for example, Spa, that has a lot of high-speed corners, then this will help the car to rotate. It'll be freer overall in those corners. The lower you have the rear ride height in relation to the front ride height, the tighter and more stable and secure the rear of the car will be in those high-speed corners. So this is a very simple but highly effective adjustment for the car. So keep in mind, any adjustments you decide to make here, don't make 10 millimeter adjustments. Make small 2 or 3 millimeter adjustments. Go out and run several laps and see if it indeed helps the car. So that's going to do it for today. Thank you guys so much for joining me, and I hope this video has been helpful in helping you to get started in Assetto Corsa Competizione.